What do you do when the world chains your body, but your soul still wants to fly? Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's figures story, we reflect on a man whose name is etched into history, but whose heart, for decades, remained locked behind bars. This isn't just a tale about apartheid or politics. It's about one man's private war against bitterness, the decision to forgive instead of revenge, and how God's unseen grace can mold history's sharpest edges into something redemptive. He was sentenced to die in a cell, but walked out with a smile. Why? This is the story of Nelson Mandela, not as a statue, but as a man, afraid, angry, alone, who learned to let go of hate, and in doing so, change the world. It didn't begin in a prison. It began on a grassy hill in the village of Qunu, where a barefoot boy raced down the slopes, chasing calves with nothing but laughter in his chest and dust in his toes. Back then, he wasn't Nelson. He was Rolihlahla, a Xhosa name meaning pulling the branch of a tree, or as some elders joked, troublemaker. He had no idea that his name would one day echo across continents. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniswa, was a chief, proud and stern. When he died, the boy was just 9. Young Rolihlahla was sent to live with Chief Jongintaba, the regent of the Thembu people. Suddenly, the village hills were traded for stone walls, dusty roads, and formal meals with royalty. He watched men argue over justice, watched silence used like a weapon, watched decisions tear families apart. Politics, he learned early, wasn't about power. It was about people. But it wasn't until school that the world gave him another name. The teacher couldn't pronounce Rolihlahla, so she gave him an English one. "From today, you'll be Nelson," she said. He never knew why she chose that name. He just nodded. But in that small moment, something was taken, and something was born. By his 20s, Nelson Mandela had moved to Johannesburg, that glittering city of gold and tension. He studied law at the University of Witwatersrand. He wore suits, walked with confidence, and yet he was always followed, questioned, eyed with suspicion. The color of his skin always entered the room first. In 1948, apartheid became law. The white minority government declared that South Africa would officially separate the races in housing, jobs, education, even love. Everything was legal, except justice. Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, and soon led their youth league. He believed in protest, in petitions, in peaceful resistance. But then came Sharpeville. 69 unarmed protesters were gunned down by police. Most shot in the back as they fled. That day, Mandela stood over the names of the dead and knew something had broken. He looked in the mirror and asked, "If peace isn't heard, must fire speak?" So he made a choice, a dangerous one. Mandela co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, a militant wing of the ANC. They sabotaged infrastructure, not people. They destroyed symbols of oppression, power plants, rail lines, government offices. He wanted to avoid bloodshed, but even that wasn't enough to protect him. In 1962, Mandela was arrested. First, for leaving the country without permission. Then, for sabotage. The second charge came with the possibility of death. At the Rivonia trial, Mandela stood in court, wearing a dark suit, holding no notes, and he said, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The courtroom went still. They didn't sentence him to death, but almost. He was given life imprisonment. They sent him to Robben Island, a barren rock in the sea, cold winds, hard beds, and stone walls. But what would break most men only began to shape him. He was 44 when he entered. He would be 71 when he walked out. He didn't know it yet, but prison would teach him more than books ever could. It would teach him patience, silence, the poison of hate, and slowly, painfully, how to let it go. But what happened inside those stone walls wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of a miracle. Robben Island didn't kill Nelson Mandela, but it tried. It tried through its silence, through its slow grind, through its humiliations. The island was a place where time went to die, where freedom became a rumor and the wind carried nothing but the echo of footsteps on concrete. The cell they gave him was smaller than a bathroom, 7 feet long, 5 feet wide, a bucket for a toilet, a thin mat on the stone floor, 1 pair of shorts, 1 shirt, no socks, no hot water. "This isn't prison," he once whispered to himself in the dark. "This is burial." But something strange happened in that grave. He didn't rot. He grew. In the early years, Mandela was defiant, sharp, angry. He refused to wear the short trousers they gave black prisoners, fought for long pants as a basic dignity. He organized hunger strikes. He wrote letters that were censored into silence. The guards mocked him, calling him boy. Some tried to break him with isolation. Others insulted his wife, Winnie, who was also being harassed, arrested, and banned back in Johannesburg. But Mandela did something unexpected. He watched the guards. He learned their names, learned their fears. He observed their routines like a scientist, noting who softened with eye contact and who hardened with rage. He studied them, not to hate them, but to understand them. And slowly cracks formed in the stone. One guard, Christo Brand, was just 18 when he was assigned to Mandela. Over time, Mandela would ask about his family, his farm, his dreams. Brand later said, "He treated me as a human being, before I even saw him as one." For the first decade, Mandela wasn't allowed to touch his wife or see his children grow. Letters were rare. News came months late. But inside, he began to ask himself a dangerous question. If I hate them, what makes me different? And in that question, something holy began to form. He started using the prison yard as a classroom. Every morning, inmates crushed stones under the brutal sun. So Mandela turned that yard into a university. He and others debated politics, history, poetry. They called it the Robben Island University, a place where dignity survived even when skin cracked from the heat. He learned Afrikaans, the language of his jailers, not to surrender, but to build a bridge. He read their books, understood their fears, noticed that some guards had dreams, regrets, even kindness they were afraid to show. He told fellow prisoners, "They are not the enemy. The system is." Outside, the world began to shift. In the 1970s and 80s, the anti-apartheid movement was growing louder. International pressure mounted. Sanctions hit. Protesters filled streets from London to Lagos. But Mandela remained inside, invisible, mysterious, quiet. That silence became powerful. People began to whisper his name like a prayer. "Free Mandela, free Mandela, free Mandela." But years passed, and still, no freedom. Then, in 1985, the South African government offered him a deal. "We'll release you if you renounce violence." Mandela, then in his mid-60s, frail from tuberculosis and years of labor, sat with the offer in hand. All he had to do was write a statement, sign a piece of paper. He could walk free, see his family, hold his grandchildren. He refused. "Only free men can negotiate," he wrote. "A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." It wasn't pride, it was principle. He would not trade dignity for daylight. But something else had begun. Secret meetings, in a small prison house away from public eyes, government ministers began meeting Mandela in private. At first, they expected anger, but what they got was something deeper. Mandela listened. He asked questions. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He forgave them, before they had even apologized. And that shook them. He hadn't seen the ocean in decades, hadn't touched a tree, hadn't slept in a bed. But he still had faith. Faith that one day, the chains would fall. And when they did, he didn't want to be the man who came out with a clenched fist. He wanted to be the man who came out with an open hand. It was a Sunday. Warm. The sun rose over Cape Town, with the quiet expectancy of something sacred. Outside Victor Verster prison, thousands gathered. Journalists, activists, strangers holding signs, with trembling hands. Some had been waiting since dawn. Others had been waiting decades. And then, There he was, Nelson Mandela. Tall, gray-haired, dignified. He wore a suit, his back straight, his smile quiet, his steps deliberate. Like every footfall was a prayer. He held the hand of Winnie, his wife, as they walked forward together like a vision pulled from the clouds. He didn't raise his fist, he raised his open palm. And in that gesture, something melted in millions of hearts. Across South Africa, people wept. Black families clapped and danced in dusty townships. White families watched television in silence, some unsure if they were seeing the beginning of peace or the beginning of revenge, because the world expected vengeance. After all, he had been imprisoned for 27 years. He had missed birthdays, weddings, funerals. He had been called a terrorist, beaten, isolated, erased from public memory. Surely, they thought, this man will now demand justice with fire in his voice. But he didn't. At his first public rally in Cape Town, he stepped to the podium as a free man. And with the eyes of the world upon him, Nelson Mandela didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't even scold. He said, "I stand before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people." And then, let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. He called for reconciliation, not retribution. Some within the African National Congress were stunned. They had expected war talk, power grabs, maybe even military action. Instead, Mandela met with old enemies. He shook hands with white leaders. He praised their courage to negotiate. When asked why, he said, "Resentment is like drinking poison, and then hoping it will kill your enemies." But privately, the battle wasn't over. Inside, the wounds still bled. He would later confess in his memoir, "I had no clear idea what the future held. I was still uncertain about my ability to lead." There were nights he sat alone and questioned if his forgiveness was weakness. Nights when memories of cold floors and barking guards returned like shadows. And there was Winnie. They had been a symbol of love and resistance. But 27 years and separate lives left cracks. She had changed. He had changed. Pain had built walls between them that love could not always tear down. They tried, they failed, they separated. Even now, Mandela's greatest gift was not his perfect strength, but his honest struggle. He felt anger, but chose grace. He knew revenge, but chose restraint. And then, he did the unthinkable. He ran for president. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. People lined up for miles to vote. Some waited 10 hours, some arrived barefoot, some brought chairs, some brought songs. They didn't care that they were choosing their leader for the first time in their lives. Mandela cast his vote and quietly said, "It is like a dream. I can hardly believe it." When the votes were counted, he had won. And just like that, a man once labeled prisoner 466/64 was now president of the Republic of South Africa. He stood on the stage at his inauguration, wearing a black suit, a tie, and an expression of both pride and humility. Dignitaries from every corner of the globe watched as he took the oath. And in his speech, he said, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will experience the oppression of one by another." The crowd erupted, but his next move would shock even his supporters. He invited his jailer. One of the prison guards from Robben Island stood behind him at the inauguration. And when asked why, Mandela simply said, "He was part of my journey too." What kind of heart remembers pain and still offers a seat at the table? Was it politics? Or was it something deeper, something divine? Nelson Mandela had walked out of prison into the arms of a nation. But now, he was walking into something even more dangerous: power. And unlike prison, power has no bars, only mirrors. Every decision would now be watched, every word weighed, every hesitation seen as betrayal by someone. To white South Africans, he was still a mystery. Could they trust him? To black South Africans, he was a symbol of deliverance. Would he deliver? But Mandela understood something deeper. The real war wasn't over land or laws. It was over hearts. The new South Africa was not a neat ending, it was a fragile beginning. The economy was imbalanced. Communities were still segregated. Bitterness hung in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire. Some of Mandela's supporters wanted revenge, land seizures, arrests, payback. And some white South Africans stockpiled weapons, expecting an uprising. Mandela chose something else. He called it the Rainbow Nation. A vision of black, white, Indian, and colored South Africans living together, not just side by side, but as one people. But that kind of unity couldn't be legislated. It had to be forgiven into existence. That's when he made one of the most controversial decisions of his life. He invited the Springboks, South Africa's national rugby team, to the presidential palace. To many black South Africans, the Springboks were a hated symbol of apartheid. The team was nearly all white. Their games were watched mostly by white fans. The green and gold jersey represented exclusion. Mandela wore it anyway. During the 1995 Rugby World Cup, hosted in South Africa, Mandela appeared at the final match, wearing a Springbok jersey with the captain's number on the back. The crowd of 60,000, mostly white, fell into stunned silence. Then, they stood and roared, "Nelson! Nelson! Nelson!" It was the first time many of them had ever chanted the name of a black man in celebration. And when the Springboks won, Mandela handed the trophy to the team captain, Francois Pienaar, and said, "Thank you for what you have done for our country." Later, when asked why he embraced a team so many of his own people hated, he said, "If I didn't, who would?" But not all wounds heal in public. Behind the scenes, families still carried grief. Mothers still wept over missing sons. Townships still bore the scars of apartheid's violence. So Mandela did something unthinkable in world politics. He didn't call for trials. He called for truth. In 1996, Mandela established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Its mission? Not to punish, but to reveal. Victims came forward with stories of torture, murder, and horror. And perpetrators, including police officers and military agents, were invited to confess everything in exchange for amnesty. It was raw, it was brutal, it was messy. Some called it naive, some called it cowardice. But Mandela believed it was the only way to prevent a civil war of memory. He said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." And perhaps no greater courage existed than to face your enemy's confession and say, "I still see your humanity." But even as Mandela guided the nation, his body was growing tired. He was in his late 70s. The presidency wore heavily. He would take early meetings, work late into the night, attend funerals, meet children, comfort widows. When offered a second term, he refused. South Africa must not depend on one man, he said. We are not a monarchy. On his last day as president in 1999, he left his office without ceremony. Just a quiet walk to his car. He opened the door himself, sat down, and smiled. He was now a private citizen again, but his soul belonged to the world. Camera lights faded. The chants grew quiet. The seat of power was no longer his. And for the first time in decades, Nelson Mandela was just a man. No more handshakes with presidents, no more late-night negotiations, no more urgent calls that began with Mr. President. But freedom had a new face now. It was retirement. And Mandela, after surviving 27 years of prison and 5 years of presidency, was about to face his most silent test yet. What is a man when the world no longer needs him to save it? He returned to Qunu, the village of his childhood. The hills were still green, the cows still moved slowly, children still ran barefoot across the fields, just like he once did. He would sit on the porch in the early mornings, watching the mist rise, sipping tea, listening to birdsong instead of applause. But the silence echoed. Mandela didn't stay quiet for long. Even in retirement, his spirit burned for justice. He began the Nelson Mandela Foundation, focusing on peace, education, and social development. He raised money for schools, spoke out about HIV/AIDS when others stayed silent, and quietly visited orphans and hospitals, away from cameras, away from headlines. But something had shifted in him. He had carried the weight of a nation's pain, and now it was pressing inward. In private letters and moments with close friends, he admitted, "Sometimes I wonder if I gave too much to the cause and not enough to the people I loved." His relationship with his children was distant, complicated. Years of separation had left scars. He loved them, but he had missed them growing up. Then came the pain of loss. In 2005, his son, Magatho, died of AIDS-related illness. Mandela held a press conference, not to speak of sorrow, but to end silence. He stood before microphones and said, "Let us give publicity to HIV/AIDS and not hide it, for that is the only way to make it appear like a normal disease." It was one of the first times a major African leader publicly addressed the epidemic without shame. Behind his steady voice, though, his eyes betrayed a quiet devastation. He had outlived his son. In those later years, Mandela became a symbol across the world. Leaders quoted him. Schools bore his name. Statues were carved. But none of it brought back the time lost behind bars. None of it softened the ache in his bones, and yet he never grew bitter. Even as old age slowed him, even as his hearing faded and his walk stiffened, Mandela remained gracious. He would often say, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." Then came the final years. In 2013, at the age of 95, Nelson Mandela fell ill. The nation held its breath. Crowds gathered outside hospitals. Candles lit windows across continents. Children held signs that read, "We love you, Madiba." And on December 5th, 2013, the world stood still. Mandela passed away peacefully at his home in Johannesburg. The next day, a double rainbow appeared over his home. Some said it was just light and rain. Others whispered that it was a sign, a celestial salute to a man who had lived between storms and still found the colors. His funeral drew the world. Presidents, kings, villagers, cellmates, and children all came together. They sang, they wept, they told stories. They remembered a man not because he was perfect, but because he had forgiven anyway. But the question remained, was he too gentle? Did his grace delay justice? Some South Africans feel that true economic healing never came. Some believe forgiveness outpaced accountability. Some still wait for the promise of equality to reach their doorstep. And maybe that's the point. Mandela never claimed to finish the work. He only carried it forward with a heart that refused to harden. In the end, perhaps that's what made him extraordinary. Not that he never broke, but that he broke open instead of breaking apart. How do you measure a legacy built not on vengeance, but on restraint? When the dust of history settles, we often build statues. We name roads, create holidays, teach speeches in classrooms. But in Mandela's case, none of that feels big enough. Because Nelson Mandela didn't just change laws, he changed the emotional chemistry of a nation, and maybe the world. There's something almost unnatural about his choice. To forgive, not once, but continually. To share tea with the same men who erased your youth. To smile at the memory of your captors. To lead a nation with no sword in hand, only an open palm. That doesn't come from political training. It comes from something deeper, something spiritual. Mandela never claimed to be religious in a formal way, but he often spoke of divine timing. He believed in the rhythm of the universe, that some things couldn't be forced, only endured. He said, "I never lose. I either win or I learn." And what he learned in prison, he passed on to millions. Lesson 1. Anger is valid, but not sacred. Mandela never denied his rage. He once admitted he was consumed with hatred after the Sharpeville massacre. But in prison, he came to see that hate was a chain. He said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew. If I didn't leave my bitterness behind, I'd still be in prison." Forgiveness wasn't surrender, it was liberation. Lesson 2. Dignity is a quiet revolution. Mandela understood the power of how you carry yourself. Even as a prisoner, he stood tall. He spoke in full sentences. He looked his jailers in the eye, not with fury, but with presence. He wore his pain like a tailored suit, not to hide it, but to say, "This will not define me." He taught that leadership is not loud, it is anchored. Lesson 3. True strength is choosing the harder road. Anyone can retaliate. It takes strength to withhold fire when fire is offered. Mandela had the numbers. He had the support. He could have ordered retribution, could have flipped the system. But he didn't. And in doing so, he redefined power, not as dominance, but as discipline. He showed the world that humility is not weakness. It is a higher kind of strength. Lesson 4. Time is a tool, not a torment. Mandela waited through betrayals, through broken promises, through years when no one said his name aloud. He didn't rush fate, he prepared for it. He sharpened his soul in the quiet so that when history finally knocked, he didn't answer with ego. He answered with wisdom. And maybe that's the most beautiful mystery of his life. God didn't take Mandela out of the fire. He left him in it, not to punish him, but to purify him. Mandela's story is proof that sometimes the most powerful tool for change is not rebellion, but refinement. And sometimes God doesn't deliver us from suffering. He delivers others through it. But what about us? What does Mandela's journey say to someone far from South Africa? To a woman betrayed by her family? To a man overlooked at work? To a child who feels abandoned? Maybe. It says this: you are not what was done to you. You are what you choose next. Because forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without rage. It's saying, you hurt me, but you do not get to hold my future hostage. It's walking free on the inside before the door ever opens. Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." He wasn't just talking about democracy, he was talking about the human heart. What would you have done if they stole half your life and handed it back without apology? That's the question that haunts the quiet corners of Nelson Mandela's story. Not just the public triumph, but the private restraint. Because while the world cheered his return, while news anchors spoke of peace and progress, Mandela stood in rooms with men who had ordered beatings, signed off on executions, separated children from their parents. And instead of shaking his fist, he shook their hands. It wasn't because he didn't remember. It was because he remembered too well. There's a story not often told. Sometime after his release, Mandela met with a former prison guard, one particularly cruel during the Robben Island years. The man came to apologize, nervously, shamefully. He expected to be rejected, maybe humiliated. Instead, Mandela offered him tea. They sat in a quiet room, no press, no speech, just silence between a broken man and the man he'd tried to break. Mandela didn't just forgive him, he thanked him for the courage to come. Moments like that didn't make headlines, but they were the real currency of his legacy. Not what he did on stage, but what he did when no one was looking. And that's where the weight of his choices starts to reflect back at us. Because Mandela's life was not an invitation to worship him. It was a mirror. How many of us carry wounds that we refuse to name? How many of us drink from the cup of resentment and call it justice? How many of us say, "I'm over it," but still check the wound every morning? Mandela reminds us, you can be right and still be imprisoned by pain. You can be the victim and still become the villain. If you let the wound rot into bitterness, what would you have done? Would you have left that prison with your head high and your heart still open? Would you have risked forgiving too early, just to stop the bleeding? Would you have trusted peace, even when justice felt incomplete? Mandela's gift wasn't that he had answers. It was that he asked better questions than the world expected. Can I forgive without forgetting? Can I lead without vengeance? Can I be angry and still be kind? These aren't the questions of a politician. They're the questions of a soul. In many ways, Mandela didn't just walk South Africa out of apartheid. He walked humanity out of a mindset. He rewrote the story of what strength looks like, not the clenched fist, but the hand that opens, even when it's shaking. And maybe that's what God was shaping all along. Not a hero, but a man willing to be soft when the world demanded steel. It's easy to light a match, harder to hold a candle. There's a famous African proverb Mandela often quoted: "I am because we are." That was the heartbeat of his life. Ubuntu, a belief that our humanity is tied to one another, that my liberation is incomplete without yours. That dignity is not a zero-sum game. It's a flame meant to be passed, not possessed. So what is the torch he left us? What is the long walk we must continue? Perhaps it's this: to forgive without being asked, to lead without needing applause, to believe in healing even when the wound still stings. Because somewhere in your life, there is someone you haven't forgiven. Someone who doesn't deserve it. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. Maybe it's about who needs to be free. The man is gone. But what about the mission? Nelson Mandela left this world in 2013, but his dream did not. Or did it? That's the uncomfortable question that hovers over his legacy. Because after all the poetry, the rainbows, the speeches and statues, South Africa still limps through the very wounds Mandela tried to close. Poverty, inequality, corruption, and anger boiling just beneath the surface. To many, he is still Tata Madiba, the father of the nation. But to others, especially a younger generation, he is a man whose forgiveness may have come too soon. They ask, why didn't he demand economic justice? Why did he let the old system survive? Why are the same families still rich and the same neighborhoods still broken? For those born after apartheid, Mandela is a photograph, a story, a symbol. But symbols don't fix potholes, and heroes don't hand out jobs. Still, perhaps it's unfair to ask one man to finish what history has broken over centuries. Mandela opened the gate. He never claimed to build the palace. But there is truth in the frustration. The land wasn't fully returned. The schools remained unequal. The police still carried the shadows of the old regime. And after Mandela stepped down, politics began to rot. Greed took root. Hope got quiet. Even Desmond Tutu, Mandela's spiritual ally, once said, "Madiba is no magician. He is just a man." And that's the point. Mandela's real gift was not that he solved every injustice. It's that he chose not to become the injustice he fought. Imagine if Mandela had chosen revenge. Imagine if he had nationalized everything, purged every white official, labeled every Afrikaner as guilty. There would have been blood, a new cycle of hate, a different kind of apartheid, flipped upside down but still brutal. Instead, he tried to plant a seed, not a utopia, but a possibility. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part the world misunderstands. Mandela didn't give South Africa a finished painting. He gave them a canvas and said, "Now, paint your future." But the brush wasn't just his to hold. So what happened when that brush fell into other hands? After Mandela's presidency, South Africa entered a time of political disillusionment. Corruption scandals hit the ANC. Leaders misused funds. Townships remained poor while mansions got taller. Mandela watched in silence, then finally said in 2007, "There are many misfortunes in life. One of them is to see your struggle betrayed by those who carry your name." He was hurt, but he never used that pain to reclaim power. He stayed in the shadows, whispering warnings, offering guidance when asked, but refusing to become a god. Because he knew something most don't. Even holy causes can rot when people forget the humility that built them. Still, even with the setbacks, his presence continued to heal. In 2010, South Africa hosted the FIFA World Cup. It was the first time the tournament had come to Africa. The stadiums glowed with hope. Flags danced in every township. For a brief moment, the dream felt alive again. And on the final day, an old man in a hat and scarf stepped into the stadium. The crowd erupted. Mandela smiled, weak but radiant. And the world remembered, not just the man, but the feeling. The feeling that forgiveness could hold a country together. Even just for a little longer. So, is the dream alive? Or did Mandela simply hold the flood back long enough for a few more children to grow up in peace? Maybe the better question is, do we carry it now? The long walk to forgiveness doesn't end at one man's grave. It ends where we pick it up or leave it behind. What would Mandela say if he were alive today? Would he recognize the world we live in now? A world of endless scrolling, loud outrage, and quiet despair? Would he look at our politics, our communities, our relationships, and shake his head? Or would he smile the way he did when hope felt impossible and whisper, "Forgiveness is still your strongest weapon"? It's a strange thing. We live in an age that prizes being right more than being kind. Every argument is a war. Every comment section a battlefield. People cancel each other faster than they heal. But Mandela's life reminds us of something radically different. You can win and still lose your soul. When he walked out of prison, he could have sought revenge. He could have held grudges that would have justified themselves in the eyes of the world. Instead, he asked, "What will heal this land?" And maybe that's the same question we need to ask now. What will heal me? What will heal us? Mandela's lessons for today's world. Patience over speed. We want justice fast, change fast, success fast. But Mandela reminds us that the deepest shifts take time, sometimes decades. What if the waiting is part of the preparation? Conversation over cancellation? He spoke to his enemies, listened to them, saw their fear. Do we even try that anymore? Vision over bitterness. Mandela once said, "Lead from the back and let others believe they are in front." It's not about proving we're stronger. It's about proving we're wiser. There's a story of Mandela at a private dinner years after his presidency. A waiter brought him tea, and Mandela quietly asked if the young man could sit down for a moment. The room went silent. The waiter, nervous, sat. Mandela smiled and asked him about his family, his dreams, his worries. Afterwards, one guest whispered, "You spoke to him like an equal." Mandela replied, "Because he is." This humility, this seeing of others, might be the medicine we've forgotten in our age of division. Not a blind tolerance, not agreeing with everything, but recognizing the human heart in front of us, even when we don't like it. Maybe Mandela's greatest advice for today is this: you don't have to forgive the whole world, but start with the room you're in. Think of someone in your life right now, someone you haven't forgiven. Maybe they hurt you, maybe they betrayed you, maybe they don't even care. What would Mandela tell you? He'd probably smile, tilt his head, and ask, "Do you want to stay in that prison?" Because holding on to anger is like being jailed by your own heart. But what if forgiveness feels impossible? What if the hurt is too deep, the wound too fresh? Mandela's answer was simple. Start small. Forgive a moment, not a lifetime. Forgive for your own peace, not for theirs. Forgiveness is not an event, it's a walk, a long one, just like Mandela's. The room was dim, curtains drawn, family nearby, and Nelson Mandela, Madiba, lay quietly in his bed. His breathing was slow now. The fire of speeches and struggle had settled into stillness. No more crowds, no more cameras. Just the quiet breath of a man nearing the end of a long, hard, holy journey. The house was filled with memories, photographs, books, gifts from world leaders, crayons from children, medals, letters, worn slippers by the door. But none of those things mattered now. Because Nelson Mandela wasn't thinking of awards. He was thinking of people. He had asked once, years earlier, not to be remembered as a saint. He said, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps trying." In those final days, his family gathered close. His eldest daughter, Makaziwe, would later say, "He was at peace, completely at peace. There was no fear." But even peace has its ghosts. At one moment, he whispered something strange. "Did I do enough?" That question hung in the air. This was Nelson Mandela, the man who helped end apartheid, who forgave his jailers, who united a nation, who inspired the world. And yet in his last hours, he asked the same thing so many of us do at the end of a hard road. Was it enough? He thought of his children, the time lost, the birthdays missed, the trauma they inherited. He thought of his people, the promises unfinished, the poverty still lingering. He thought of his wife, Winnie, their complicated love, the distance between what was and what could have been. He thought of God. He never preached religion, but he prayed, often, quietly. In Robben Island, he had whispered prayers in the dark, sometimes to survive the night, sometimes to soothe the bitterness creeping in. And now, in the final night, it is said that a soft prayer escaped his lips again, not for himself, for his people. On December 5th, 2013, the world woke to the news Nelson Mandela had passed away. 95 years old, peacefully at home. South Africa stopped, and then it wept. Across every continent, candles were lit, flags lowered, streets flooded with flowers. But in Qunu, in that little village where the barefoot boy had once raced the cows down grassy hills, they prepared the land. He was buried there, under the African sky, close to the soil he loved. The whole world watched, and yet, somehow, it felt personal, as if each person had lost someone they knew, a father, a mentor, a friend. Even those who disagreed with him mourned him, because something about his life had pierced deeper than politics, something divine. In the months after his death, there were stories of how he'd sent secret money to families in need, of how he kept lists of prisoners no one else remembered and fought for their release, of how, in his final weeks, he asked not for legacy, but for peace in his country's schools. Not skyscrapers, not headlines, schools. Because Mandela believed the true future was not in government, but in children. One of the last things he wrote was this: "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others. That will determine the significance of the life we lead." So, was it enough? Maybe that's not the question. Maybe the question is, will we walk as far as he did, with as much grace? Because now, the long walk to forgiveness is not Mandela's anymore. It's yours, it's mine. The fire is low now, the story told. But something remains. Quiet, glowing, waiting. And it's this: Mandela didn't walk alone. He walked for every soul who ever felt unseen. He walked for the child behind the fence, for the prisoner behind the wall, for the widow behind the curtain, for the quiet voice in a loud world. And now, the question is no longer about him. It's about you. When anger tempts you to speak before listening, when pride pushes you to win instead of understand, when hurt begs you to shut your heart and lock the door, what will you do? Will you keep walking? Because the long walk to forgiveness was never just political. It's personal. It's the fight to stay soft in a world gone hard, to choose grace when grudges are easier, to reach out when it would be more satisfying to pull away. Mandela never said it would be easy. He never made it look easy, but he showed it was possible. And if he, a man who lost 27 years, a man who buried his son, a man who forgave his jailer, a man who stepped down from power, a man who walked out of a cell and smiled, if he could forgive, then maybe you can too. Maybe not today, maybe not perfectly, but eventually, one step, one breath, one brave decision not to stay chained to pain that no longer serves you. There's a word in Mandela's language, xhosa, ukuksolela. It means not just to forgive, but to restore peace. Not just to set others free, but to set yourself free. So tonight, as the fire burns low and the story finds its end, take a moment. Think of the anger you've carried too long, the apology you never received, the resentment you wear like armor, the revenge you fantasize about, but never act on. And ask, what would Mandela do? Then go a step deeper. What would God want me to do? Because in the quiet corners of Mandela's life, behind the parades and interviews, was a whisper. A life surrendered to purpose, to healing, to something greater than pride. He didn't just lead a nation. He lit a path. A path you can walk too, not in the headlines, but in your home, your marriage, your job, your friendships, your silence. So here's the final question, one that only you can answer. What prison are you still living in that you already hold the key to? Thank you for walking with us tonight, for sitting by the fire, for listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. Nelson Mandela's long walk is over, but maybe yours is just beginning. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs it. And if you'd like to hear more stories of wisdom, redemption, and grace, you know where to find us. Good night.